it was all a bit of a blur now, but I can remember you just shouting out to me, paddle! So we just both put our paddles in the water and we paddled as hard as we could. And then slowly, I started to realise that we were getting ridiculously close to this container and we were moving at a hell of a speed. The water's just being sucked underneath, and we realised that if we had hit that, the canoe would have just, it would have been over. The canoe would have just exploded, I think, at the speed we were going at, and we would have been pulled under.
Welcome back to the show. I'm Paul Schmid, the host of The Pursuit Zone, a podcast that interviews explorers from around the globe to bring you their exciting stories. These are people that dream big, break out of their comfort zones, and take on ambitious pursuits. This is episode 179 with Ian Finch and Jamie Barnes, where we talk about their canoe and hiking journey along the Cherokee Trail of Tears. This is Ian's second time on the show. He first appeared in episode 129 talking about a Yukon River expedition, and you can find that episode at thepursuitzone.com/TPZ129. Let's start the show, and let me introduce my guests. After the Indian Removal Act was signed into law by President Andrew Jackson in 1830, the U.S. government began a series of relocations of Native Americans from their ancestral lands in the southeast to areas west of the Mississippi River. The 5 civilized tribes consisting of Cherokee, Creek, Seminole, Chickasaw, and Choctaw were all part of the forced removals. In 1838, the Cherokee people were removed via a series of land and water routes from their ancestral homelands in the Great Smoky Mountains to Tahlequah, Oklahoma. It's estimated that of the 16,000 removed, between 4,000 to 8,000 Cherokee died from hunger, exposure, and disease. This journey was known amongst the Cherokee as the Trail Where They Cried, today known as the Trail of Tears. Beginning in mid-March 2019, photographer Ian Finch and Jamie Barnes retraced the original trail from the Smoky Mountains into Tahlequah, Oklahoma. For over 81 days, they descended flooded rivers, canoeing close to 1,000 miles, then continued on foot for 400 miles. You can learn more about their journey at Ian's website, ianefinch.com, and at sidetracked.com, where you can learn more about their upcoming feature article in Sidetracked Magazine's October issue. Ian Finch and Jamie Barnes, welcome to the Pursuit Zone.
How you doing?
I'm doing fine. How are you guys doing?
Very well. Yeah,
very good. Thank you.
Very excited for this podcast.
Guys, how did this idea and how did this project come together?
For the two of us, this adventure kind of started its roots about 2 years ago. So in 2017, me and Ian were on a wild camping weekend in the Cotswolds, which is just a small area in sort of the west of England. And on this trip, we were discussing future ideas, plans for adventures and expeditions and things like that. And Ian asked me if I could do any expedition with cost being no object, just as a sort of theoretical question. I said I would want to retrace the Trail of Tears. My reasoning for that, I've always had a really strong interest in First Nation cultures around the world, which at that time I then found out Ian had too. So us discussing this trip, the seed was kind of planted there for us to embark on this adventure together. And I actually found out about the Trail of Tears through a friend of mine who lives in Florida, Jake. And he told about the events of the Trail of Tears, which in the UK, we don't learn sort of none of that kind of history. We don't learn much about the US history as a start, let alone that of like the native cultures and stuff that were there before. So this was quite a big surprise for me when I learned about this moment in history and how fairly recent it was. So it was quite impactful for me. Yeah, once me and Ian started talking about it, that was it. We kind of decided we had to do it.
When you guys were starting to plan this, my understanding is you went to the Cherokee people and began talking to them about this. What was their reaction? What did they say?
Well, the initial planning for the trip was to really include the Cherokee Nation and to work with the Cherokee Nation. That was a fundamental desire for the expedition itself. And firstly, really, we wanted their blessing because it's a sacred Cherokee trail, and we wanted to do this from a real place of truth and clarity. So we wanted to really speak to them first. So it took quite a few months to find the right people to speak to, and it was only when a friend of mine who is a photographer of Native American tribes, she gave me a link and a business card and an email address to someone within the Cherokee Nation. So I emailed them initially asking for permission to do the trail. We opened up some dialogue and communication, and I spoke to them about their proposed route, timelines, dates, and everything like that. So in the end, we came to sort of an agreement as such, and we had a great conversation about us doing the trail and how we could work together and how they could share the story of our journey. When we had cleared that with them and they gave us permission almost, we then started to talk about the latter part of the trip, and how we wanted to finish the trail with members of the Cherokee Nation. So the 400-mile walk, which was into Oklahoma, we agreed that we would walk with two members of the Cherokee Nation, two young brothers named Ryder and Parker Weevil. And we would walk with a language expert, someone who was around 60s, maybe 65 years old, who had a lot of experience with Cherokee history, culture, traditions, and the sustain or the preservation of those cultural traditions. And we finished it. We finished the trip with them, and that was all due to the good work that the Cherokee Nation did, and the people that helped us within the Cherokee Nation that helped pull all those components together.
How much time did you guys put planning into this expedition?
From when we first conceived the idea to when we started, it was, I think, just over 2 years. But most of the planning really kind of happened in the 8 months that ran up to it.
A lot of the planning was the actual initial stage of talking to members of the Cherokee Nation and sort of getting the clearance, and the actual physical planning of routes and rivers and stuff like that was actually Jamie. Jamie did a lot of good work with planning of logistics and food and mapping and timings and stuff like that. So that Jamie did a lot of that in and out of work. But the real sort of crux of all the planning happened within the last 5 to 6 months, sending food to our contact in Chicago and really physically finding and working out those exact points of those routes where we were going to start and finish from.
Did you bring everything from the UK over into Chicago, or did you work with any outfitters here to help you supply?
We brought most of our kit with us. The only things we sent ahead was the food. We have a company in the UK called Firepot. They make these fantastic dehydrated meals, which they just try to use completely natural ingredients, no preservatives or artificial things and stuff like that. We got in contact with them. We were able to get a load of food with them. So we sent loads of that to the US in advance. But there was one hiccup that we hadn't actually prepared for when this happened, was that when we sent the first batch of food over, we weren't fully aware of the regulations that the United States border had in terms of meat products coming into the country. So how many meals did we send over first time? About 30 or so?
Yeah,
we sent
around
about
that time.
30 meals into the country, and all of them were destroyed essentially because they had meat in them. So we then had to take a step back and think, how were we going to work around this? So we had to, for the food that we sent into the country, we had to go completely vegetarian meals, which wasn't an issue. It was so close to the trip actually happening that it was quite frightening that we could have got over there and not had tasty food to look forward to.
How do you learn that they're destroyed? Do they send you an email?
When you send the food, you get like a code that you can then follow online with the people that you shipped it with. So we could just constantly see updates as to where it was and what was happening. And then it was actually through the delivery service that we went through, that we found out it was being held for the reasons that the meat couldn't go into the country. For the rest of the kit, we took everything over ourselves. When we first got into the country in March, in North Carolina, it was very cold. So we just took all of our cold clothing, down jackets and such with us in our packs, knowing that as the trip went on and we went further west, getting later in the year, we knew we could then later send that stuff home. But arriving at the airport, we had pretty much everything with us. Canoe paddles strapped to our backpacks. Yeah, the lot.
Did you bring a canoe or did you get that here?
The year before the expedition, I came over and did a recce of routes, possible like mountain routes, the rivers. I checked like the river states and stuff similar to that. And I made a contact to selling used canoes. So when I got home, I emailed the gentleman in question, and we purchased a used 16-foot canoe, a Royal X canoe with paddles. So once we had done the first stage, phase 1, which was crossing the Smoky Mountains, we actually dropped down from the Smoky Mountains to the Little Tennessee River, and the gentleman met us at the Little Tennessee River with the canoe and the paddles and all of our life vests and foods and stuff like that. This expedition had a lot of moving parts, a lot of logistics of meeting people in certain places, and that was the first one that the whole expedition kind of relied on. This gentleman called Kevin Hancock, who's a specialist with canoes. And yeah, he met us at the Little Tennessee River, and we had pre-sent food to him, all of our equipment that we would literally need to go from the mountains to the river in a space of one day.
Was this the guy, or was this the person you mentioned that was in Chicago?
No, so we had a contact in Chicago who was a friend of ours, a female called Erin, and she, when we had placed sort of on social media our initial idea, she said she would love to help out being sort of our in-country contact. So we sent all of our food to her, and then we gave her separate instructions to box up certain food, certain amounts of food, and we gave her sort of addresses and all stuff like that. So when the time came, she could then just post those foods to a certain post office. So later on in the expedition, we would literally walk into that post office, pick up that food, and then continue on with the journey.
How did you guys get to your initial starting point down in the Smoky Mountains?
When I did the initial recce, I met someone who put me in contact with a guy that met us at the airport. So we had a photographer from Salt Lake City with us called Will Saunders. He's a fantastic adventure photographer. And us being both photographers, Jamie and myself, we wanted an objective view of the journey. So we paid for Will to come on the expedition with us for the first week in the mountains. So all four of us met at Atlanta airport, and then we travelled. This was about 10 o'clock at night after 17, 18 hours of travel. And then we went straight from Atlanta, drove the 4 or 5 hours into the Smoky Mountains at night. So we arrived in the Smoky Mountains at about 3 a.m, and then we woke up at 7 a.m. and continued to hike straight into the mountains. So myself, Will and Jamie, and then the friend of ours that gave us a lift to the Smoky Mountains, he drove back to Atlanta. So after flying 2 flights, 4-hour car journey and 3 hours sleep, we started the expedition, which was pretty tough.
So you guys have these shoulder-crushingly heavy packs, as if you've written about in your articles so far. And are you actually carrying with you all the food you need for the entire time, or have you set up resupplies along the way?
I'll have to start by saying that I don't think I've ever carried a pack as heavy as I did for the first 5 days of this expedition. I don't know what it is in pounds, but it must have been maybe 26, 27 kilos, all the kit that I had. Maybe not that much, but it was heavy. We only had, at the start of the trip in the Smoky Mountains, we had about 5 days worth of food, maybe 6, just to allow, if we had to stay a little bit longer, or if we got held up by snow or anything like that. But no, we didn't take all of the food at once. We just had the whole trip broken down into small sections. So later in the trip, we'd be passing the United States Postal Service, like offices, where we could then pick up resupplies. We'd be going through towns, so we could pick up food there. But then right at the start, we both had tremendously heavy packs. But Ian's a little bit taller than me, a few more muscles than me. But I think I certainly had the heavier pack, because I was packing a drone. I had a lot more camera gear, more batteries, a tripod as well. So all of that on top of all of our cold winter gear, all of the food, containers to carry water, things like battery packs, a backup battery pack, because I'd never been to the Smoky Mountains before. I had no idea what to expect. I kind of wanted to just be prepared for everything to go wrong. So there was backups of everything. But I knew that, if worse comes to worse, I could shed this weight if I needed to.
And taking into consideration that when we went on this expedition, we presumed that the Smokies were going to be in snow. So prior to getting to the Smokies, that region had some of the worst rain that they'd had in 20, 30 years. And we knew there was a cold spell coming, so there was a potential that there could be snow. So we probably overtook kit in preparation for that snow, and that included our footwear and sort of certain elements of like essential kit. And I had laptops and all sorts in my rucksack as well, and we had enough food to last us that week. So the kit reflected the weather conditions and the mountain weather conditions, and also a region that we didn't have familiarity with. Even though I'd actually been there on the recce, we prepared for the worst, and that reflected in the weight of the rucksacks. And the rucksacks were, in some cases, too heavy to lift onto your back with one person. So in some cases, we had two people lifting the rucksacks onto the back. So the Smoky Mountains are notoriously rugged, and some of the trails that go through the Smokies, again, are notoriously, the descents and ascents are incredible. So we had to take our time, especially with going down and coming up with our feet and our foot placement of everything. And the rucksacks were as heavy as I've ever carried.
It was tough to find the motivation once you was on the ground to then get back up carrying that pack.
Yeah. In minus 6 to 8 temperatures.
Celsius.
What kind of footwear did you guys have?
We had normal mountain boots, so high ankle mountain boots. We wanted to prepare for the worst. As a region, we didn't know, we didn't understand the potential weather conditions. So we took our best boots, basically. Well, I took mine anyway.
Yeah, we were both carrying lighter footwear as well. Ideally it was mostly for later in the trip, because we wanted to have good footwear. We didn't want to have to then get in the country and spend money on good footwear that we already had. So we kind of just bit our tongues and ended up just carrying this footwear that we had. So we had them strapped to the back of our packs as well. And even just at the end of the day, when we'd get to these small log cabins, which are kind of along the trails in the Smoky Mountains, it was nice to take the hiking boots off and just put on a different pair of shoes that were just a little bit more comfortable, a little bit more relaxed.
Are you walking on actual developed trails, or how does that? Or are you bushwhacking through the woods, or how's that working?
They were very well trodden trails. So the first part that we were walking on was actually the Appalachian Trail. So at this time of year, there was hundreds of people walking through, although they were heading in the opposite direction to us. So yeah, the trail was very well trodden. But then when you got to close to some of the higher peaks with the ascents and the descents, they could get quite rocky. It was so cold up there that all of the water that was still flowing down the mountain from all the heavy rainfall they had, lots of that was freezing over. So with every step you was taking, you could just hear all the ice underneath just crunching. And then on these rocky parts, there'd just be like 2 inches of solid ice in parts just down. So it was really good that we had our good footwear, because if we didn't, it would have been really dangerous. And up there, it's so isolated and there's so much tree cover that if you injure yourself, you basically have to get carried out. You can't get air rescued because there's so many trees in the way. There wasn't any bushwhacking. I could certainly imagine in the summer, some of those places would get really overgrown. So yeah, summer you definitely need to worry about that. But for us, we didn't have to worry about it at all.
So that was about 6 days, I think, that you guys were going through the Smokies, and then you met up with the guy that brought your boat, and you're getting into the Little Tennessee River. And then what happens from there? How long is that section of the Little Tennessee, and what was that like?
The Little Tennessee River connects to the actual main Tennessee River. So in its entirety, it's about 610 miles long. As it drops off the Smokies, it kind of pools into these small lakes because of dams. So along the whole of the Tennessee, every maybe 15 to 20 miles or something, there's dams. And these dams are to provide sort of hydroelectricity to the surrounding areas. So in some sections, it would go from river to lake, from river to lake, from river to lake. So the Little Tennessee River, maybe 600 meters across with 1 kilometer an hour flow, which is very slow for a river. And then it would pool into these big lakes, but you'd be passing nature reserves. You'd still be within the mountains at this point. But that first week or so, we got good weather for that first week, and we were sleeping on islands, on the riverbank, on sandbars, anywhere we could pitch up at the end of the day. But it was a very, very, very beautiful section. Very, very beautiful section. The start of it, yeah.
How long does it take to portage around those dams?
Not long. The dams, in some cases, could be from top to bottom, maybe 30 feet, 40 feet. So we could actually carry the canoe around them. So there'd be these little jetties and pontoons where you could take the canoe out and portage around, which would take anything up to like 20 minutes to half an hour of just shuttling the kit back and forwards. And then in the latter stages, the dams were sometimes 90 to 100 feet deep. So we would have to go through this locking system. So you'd paddle into these locks where these huge boats and barges would go through, and then the water would lower down to the bottom section of the river, which is on the bottom part of the dam. But the only problem was this, what that presented was the fact that if the dam was releasing water, it would create huge rapids, which were basically suicidal to go canoe out in these rapids. And there was these side channels. So if you locked through in your canoe, it would send you in this side channel down the side of the river until the rapids were seen to just settle, and you could then paddle out into the main flow of the river again. These locks are meant for huge barges carrying grain and coal and cement up and down the rivers. So a tiny, tiny canoe with two guys sitting in it, and then pulling out into these huge sort of torrents of rivers. There was a few times it was pretty dangerous, and a couple of times we actually had to get portaged around the canoes and maybe a mile downstream just for safety purposes. But I would say 80% of the dams we locked through, which quite a lot of people were really surprised that we done that because it was pretty dangerous, but we just thought it was, good fun to give it a go. When we were locking through each dam, we were meeting the lock masters and stuff like that, which were all current or previous serving US soldiers, so it's really great to meet those guys and thank them for their service and stuff like that. So it was one of probably the most exciting elements of the first stages of the Tennessee River, because for us, those were checkpoints and sometimes between huge multi-day, multi-lake sections. It was when we got to a dam, it was just another little checkpoint on this 1,000-mile canoe journey that was just for our morale. It was pretty good.
So you've got a 16-foot Royal X canoe, and what kind of paddles do you have?
Ian had one that he had used on an expedition that he'd done a few years previous, where him and a team of others paddled the length of the Yukon River, which starts in Canada, in British Columbia, then follows all through Alaska out to, is it the Bering? Mm-hmm. Bering Strait, Bering Sea. So he brought that paddle over with him from the UK. We could have got paddles supplied for us, but there was something quite nice about using this, in Ian's case, using a paddle which he'd already used before. I don't know what the make of your one is.
It's a Canadian and Montreal brand called Kessie paddles that make, I think it was made from cherry wood. And it was pretty beat up, but I had to use it. If I was I paddled the Yukon with it, and I just really wanted to use it for this trip.
Yeah, and for me, at this point, I didn't have my own sort of good canoe paddle, because whenever I've paddled in the past, I've usually just supplied them from wherever I'm going or hiring them from. I wanted to get something nice I could do similar to Ian, take it on this expedition, and then in the future I could then take it further. So I had another one which was made from Canada as well, a red tail paddle, which was fantastic.
We wanted to use wooden paddles, obviously, for the aspect of plastic and on the expedition and stuff like that, and having as least amount of plastic on the trip as we could. We wanted to use wooden paddles, and also the feel of the wooden paddles in the water are quite different to plastic or metal paddles with metal handles. We had a spare paddle in the canoe with us just for safety purposes, but thankfully our wooden paddles lasted the mountains, crossing the Smoky Mountains, which were strapped to our rucksacks, and they lasted the whole of the canoe journey down to Memphis.
I have to just add on there, when we were walking through the Smoky Mountains and we had our packs on with our paddles strapped to the back, we'd be passing all of these people who were walking the Appalachian Trail. It was a good conversation starter, having these huge paddles strapped to our packs, miles and miles away from the nearest river. So everybody questioned what the purpose of that was for.
Yeah, people couldn't understand. You can understand why you were in the mountains in March with canoe paddle strapped to your back. But then when we got to the stage of telling them about the journey and why the paddles were strapped to the rucksacks, it was pretty epic. It was good to chat to people, that kind of stuff, around a fire in an old sort of stone shelter.
I don't know the terminology. Maybe it's called a spray skirt or something. Do you have like a covering, like a deck covering for your canoe?
If we had been going over any white water, we probably would have had a spray deck. But we were only going on sort of the very gentle temperament of the Tennessee River and then the Mississippi. So we weren't going over any white water. So we deemed the spray deck. We didn't think we would need it. And spray decks usually are used if you know you're going to be in incredibly rough weather or on white water.
So 7 weeks on the rivers. What's it like out there? What are you seeing? Are you seeing lots of people? Or are you just seeing nature? What kind of wildlife are you seeing?
Bearing in mind, nowadays, there's a lot of life along the river, and that's a lot of human life, a lot of wildlife, a lot of animals. So the Tennessee River goes through the heart of Tennessee. So there's a couple of big cities, Chattanooga. And bearing in mind that it's very important for us to point out that the water route that we took is exactly the route that the Cherokee took. So when the Cherokee were removed from the Great Smoky Mountains, they were separated into many different trails. Some were taken north up through Nashville, and some were taken south, and some were taken on the river. So the Cherokee were pulled on flatbed boats behind steamers up the Tennessee River and then down the Mississippi River to the mouth of the Arkansas River and then up into Tahlequah, which the Arkansas River goes up into Tahlequah. So it was very important for us to cross the Smokies, which is the home of the Cherokee, and then follow a large section of the water route that the Cherokee took. Every few days we'd be stopping, maybe speaking to people, and if we were lucky enough to stay with people. But for most of the journey, it was pretty wild. Sleeping on the riverbanks, sleeping on islands, you would be surrounded by golden eagles, all sorts of wildlife, armadillos that would come and visit you during the night in your tents, and it was just incredible to be surrounded by ospreys as well, like following you in the canoe.
I was going to say, I don't think we both appreciated how wild it was going to be.
The Tennessee River, yeah. It's a very wild place. Very wild place.
When we were,
so I could say, looking on the map, you wouldn't think that, but the Tennessee and Arkansas, and still the Mississippi in some cases, were as sort of in sections that were probably as wild as you're going to get, really.
Did you have any dangerous situations on the river?
Oh,
many.
Yeah. Let's just say, I don't think those rivers today are designed for people to be paddling them. Although the water itself is pretty safe, once you get to the Mississippi, the current picks up, but you can manage it. But the biggest issue for us was these huge, great big barges, which were pushing anywhere from 3 to 30 of these huge, I think they were iron or steel containers, and they'd be moving coal, oil, all kinds of like gasoline and stuff, scrap, whatever. They use these rivers as like huge highways to move all of this stuff, because it's so much more efficient to move it by water than it is by road. When we were on the river, we would have to be constantly wary of these barges, because they could be moving at day, they could be moving at night. And in the day, you could be coming around a corner and one of these huge barges comes around, but they're moving pretty quick for their size. So you've constantly got to be thinking, what's around that next corner? Because if we're out in the open, we could be in trouble if that huge. I mean, how long would you say some of them were? 200, 300 meters?
Yeah.
In length?
Like
they could be huge. And that sweeping around a corner was such a huge danger for us. So we had to just constantly be aware of that. There was a couple of very closest incidents where things got really hairy. The biggest one, I think, was when we first got on the Mississippi River. So we'd done the 600 or so miles of the Tennessee River. We'd done about 200 miles of the Ohio. Mm-hmm. It might not have been that long. And then we got onto the Mississippi River. And at this point, you've got the strength of the Ohio River and the strength of the Mississippi, which are both very strong rivers. As we were getting on these rivers, right at the point where they converge, goes around the corner. So we're on this river, which, if we weren't paddling, it must have been moving about 5 miles an hour. It was extremely fast. And they'd had so much rainfall. The river was up about 20, 30 feet than usual. So all of the fields nearby were flooded as well. We're paddling down the river and the heavens were pouring down on top of us. There was lightning, thunder, heavy rainfall coming down of us. So we were kind of just taking it slow, not getting too out in the open, because we want to make sure the canoe wasn't going to fill up with rainfall, so we'd stop and empty it. And then when we were on the river where these rivers were converging, we were sticking really close to the edge, just so we didn't get in any danger. But something we hadn't quite considered at this point in time was these parked containers, which were along the side. Although they were static, we didn't realise that these were actually a huge danger to us. So we're moving on this river, which is already moving at 5 miles an hour. We're then paddling, so we're probably doing 7, maybe 8. We would sometimes leapfrog kind of between these parked containers to get out of the flow of the river. But on this one occasion, we've moved up to this parked container and stopped paddling to kind of just get our bearings, check the GPS, make sure there's no containers coming up, because we had this app that actually showed where these huge barges were. So we'd quickly stopped, we're checking that, looking at what the weather's doing. Is there even more heavy rain coming? Where's the lightning? All of that kind of stuff. And we're both looking at our phones very briefly, but it was at this same time we didn't realize the canoe was still moving, and we thought we were in this eddy, which is where the river kind of stops flowing, but we were still slowly moving towards this parked container. And it was only because Ian just briefly looked up in the direction that we were heading that he saw the canoe we were in was moving very rapidly towards this parked container. All of that power in the water was just being sucked straight under the container. And it was all a bit of a blur now, but I can remember you just shouting out to me, "Paddle!" So we just both put our paddles in the water and we paddled as hard as we could. And then slowly, I started to realise that we were getting ridiculously close to this container, and we were moving at a hell of a speed. The water's just being sucked underneath, and we realised that if we had hit that, the canoe would have just, it would have been over. The canoe would have just exploded, I think, at the speed we were going at, and we would have been pulled under. And we cleared it by about 1 metre, 2 metres. Mm-hmm. We were so close. And it wasn't until we then cleared it and we were going down the side of these containers that we realised just how fast we were going and how powerful the river was. After that had happened, we found this small town along the riverbank where we stopped. We just had to get out because we were so kind of shook up from what had just happened. The adrenaline was high. We needed to get out of the water, just get our bearings and just consider what the next steps are going to be, because there was more parked containers and barges all down the river. It wasn't safe for us to continue. So we stopped and we went into this boat shop that was there, people who service these container ships and stuff. And we said to them, we needed to find somewhere to stay. And it wasn't until we were then there talking to some of the people and we told them about what happened to us that we kind of realised just how serious of a challenge this river was from now on, with the condition it was, with the weather, the power, the river, the containers. It was a huge eye-opener for us that all along we'd been kind of narrowly avoiding this very dangerous, I don't know, how would you explain it?
One guy said to us that the power of the water going under these containers has been known to crush ship like a machine crushing a Coke can. So you think of a Coke can in those machines and the teeth, how it just grinds the ship and tears it apart and it just sucks it down. That's what we were told, that the power of the water. But bearing in mind, looking back, the months leading up to that point where we hit the Mississippi and the Ohio, there had been the largest rainfall in 20 to 30 years that region had ever had. They'd had huge snows up in the source of the rivers. So all of that water had come down and then flooded the Mississippi and the Ohio River. So the river was up 20, 30 feet. It submerged forests, trees, even some of the dikes and structures under the Mississippi were flooded. So along that journey, we were constantly having to deal with this change in the river's nature. When we were on the river, I was noticing that it was acting different. It felt like the river had changed, or something was just so different from what I'd experienced on the Yukon. And it was all because the river had flooded these trees and these forests and structures. And then we were paddling over these, and it was creating rapids. It was creating whirlpools. And it was forcing us to paddle very close to these tree lines where the water had submerged. So with the barges and the wake that's kicked out at the back of these barges, which could be sometimes 6 to 8 feet high, you're having to deal with all these new elements.
We had a couple of times we were close to capsizing when these barges come past the huge waves. If you're in a kayak, you'd be okay, but when you're in an open canoe with maybe 100 kilos of kit in there, food, our tents, electronics, cameras, all of that kind of stuff, you don't want to capsize. Everything was in dry bags. Just the mess that would be if we'd have flipped, everything going everywhere, and just the safety point of view as well. Yeah. If you're stranded out in the middle and those boats are coming past, it's difficult for them to see you because they don't expect people to be.
No, not at that time of year, and not when it's flooded. And it's very counterintuitive as well because you have to turn into the wave to basically go over the top of the wave. If you're side on, you're going to capsize, so you have to turn into these huge 6 to 8 foot waves, which. It's totally unnatural.
Yeah, the whole front half of the canoe would be out of the water.
Yeah.
It would be on a 45-degree angle as we were going over some of these waves and then just smacking down on the water on the other side.
And it's just like, hold on. Just hold the hell on.
I had no idea those boats made such big waves.
Yeah, unbelievable. I mean, the Mississippi's a super highway, so there's so much industry and stuff like that still moves up and down the Mississippi, and it's a lot cheaper for companies to use the barges and stuff like that to transport all of their goods and stuff like that up and down the Mississippi. So these barges are something that move day and night. We just had to look out for it every day. And we had to just bear our route in mind, the way we use the currents. We had to use the currents with the barges in mind, but how the barges would use the currents, we had to take that into consideration. So yeah.
Once you guys got out after that situation and your adrenaline calmed down, what did you decide to do? Did you continue on canoeing?
The following morning, the weather was good. There was because the previous day there was this huge storm which was involved in that incident. The following morning it was clear skies, winds were low, so winds play a huge part in canoeing, and they played a huge part in our trip. And we actually sat for a few hours on the riverbank drinking a coffee, debating what to do, what route to take, because this little harbour, which was a place called Wycliffe in Kentucky, I think, these barges were going in and out all morning, and we couldn't work out how to get back out onto the river because we were shell-shocked by this incident. So what we ended up doing was, there was no way we were going to stop at that point. We just had to find a way of sort of mitigating the risks and just keep moving forward, which is pretty much what the whole journey was about, because when we're in situations like this, you kind of resort back to this thought pattern of the Cherokee when they were on the river, and they were going through such struggles and tribulations and difficulties. We just couldn't stop because of something like this. We had to continue in our own way and push forward. So we found a small channel, a 6-foot channel that weaved all the way from the bank beside all of these huge barges and boats, and we just picked our way close to the bank on this 6-foot channel, and then that released us back into this super fast current. And then that day we moved back out onto the Mississippi River. And even that day, the end of that day, we had another incident where because we saw these containers on another bend, we decided to move away from these containers, but there was a barge coming directly for us. So we had no choice but to move between these barges and the shipping container and the barges. But the barge itself was making a turn. So the back of the barge was coming round closer to us and basically closing the trapdoor between us and the barges again. So we had no other choice but just to paddle as hard as we could through this sort of emerging trapdoor. And as soon as we got past the barge, we had to then turn into the barge and turn into the waves, which again is such a counterintuitive action, but you had to do it. And again, we went straight over the top of these 5-6 foot swells and just fried my nerves, basically. They were fried as they were, but that just singed them and destroyed them once more. But the thing is about when you're canoeing and you go through these scenarios, you have to continue to get on the river. You cannot be scared or anything like that. You just continue to get out on the river and you continue to paddle, because that's what will then elevate your confidence and realign your confidence, and you'll just keep moving forward and you'll keep paddling, and then you'll have 2 or 3 days when nothing happens and you'll kind of be back into your zone again.
Do you have radios? Are you able to communicate with the barge captains?
No, we didn't have radios. The only kind of information we had on them was this app that we used. I can't remember the name of it. And it's kind of like those websites and apps where you can see where like airliners are and aircraft, but it was just for boats. So you could see like all the large boats all over the world. And this was handy because we could zoom in on the river where we were. And I think every 10 minutes or so, the app updated. So we could then see where they were or have an idea that there was a boat coming up. It showed the parked ones, well, most of them, where they were as well. So that was our only kind of, not communication, but the only information we had on them. But the closer and closer we got to Memphis, as we were paddling down the Mississippi, they were just, every hour we were passing them, 2 or 3 sometimes. So we were just constantly aware that we treated every corner as though there was a barge coming, essentially.
And then we had to pad into trees, didn't we? And and tie the canoe to trees to get away from the barges and everything.
It was odd. We'd be out in this huge open river, and then suddenly we'd be just paddling through a forest, which there must have been 12, 15 feet of water below us. And below that would then be the surface of the forest. It was just quite eerie to be almost going through like a jungle with all these trees surrounding us, and then all of a sudden these waves would come crashing through the forest as the barge that we were avoiding was going past.
Well, eventually you guys make it to Memphis, and as my understanding is that's the end point of the canoe journey, and then you begin on foot. And hey, if you don't mind, Ian, I pulled out a little quote from one of your articles. I'd like to just read it here to transition into this next section. "We knew it was going to be hot, but after 42 days of paddling, our feet arrived unannounced and vastly unprepared. Jamie had suffered the most." So tell me about, what's this transition like now? You've got to put the packs back on and start walking after you've been on kind of off your feet for about 7 weeks.
We had 5 days rest in Memphis, and then we moved from Memphis all the way through Arkansas. So pretty much as soon as you leave Memphis, you go from Tennessee into Arkansas. And we chose to follow or handrail one of the Trail of Tears routes, because there's a couple that go through the northern part and then just south of us. So we decided to follow handrail one called the Bell route. The fact that we hadn't walked pretty much for 42 days, so for 7 weeks, and our feet had been wet near enough every day for 7 weeks, our feet had softened. So when we had been in Memphis, we had stripped our kit back down, which we'd sent a ton of kit home that we didn't need. And then we laid all of our kit out and really just stripped as much as we could back. And even then, our rucksacks were just so heavy to sort of account for all the equipment that we were going to need for that 4 weeks on foot. And within the first 3 or 4 days, our feet were just torn to shreds. Absolutely torn to shreds. We were walking in 86-degree heat, 80% humidity on tarmac. So a lot of the Trail of Tears route now is where highways and back roads and dirt tracks are and stuff like that. So we followed that. So effectively we were walking on the hard shoulder of main roads in some cases. So the constant pounding of walking on tarmac for 8 hours for 20 miles a day, which is what we initially planned, we couldn't actually make. We had such bad blisters on our feet, the underside of our feet. We were constantly readdressing these blisters, putting new plasters on them, new tape on them. And it got to a point where I was the actual first one that fell to bits, in all honesty. So I had to my feet were in such a bad way. We'd changed inner soles back in Memphis to sort of that we thought would help. And me and Jamie have walked a long way in our lifetimes. We've got over mountains and trails and things like that, but we just didn't expect what we encountered and our bodies to go through what we encountered. And it was just the fact that our bodies were unprepared and our feet were unprepared because we'd been sitting in the canoes so long. So I had to buy a new pair of shoes. So I changed to like a marathon running trainer, and that really, really, really helped. Jamie got a new pair of inner soles, and that really helped Jamie as well. But it was that first week was probably some of the worst physical pain with regards to an expedition that I've probably ever been in.
And somehow people donated some carts to you guys so you could take the weight off your back, and then you had to somehow try to fashion these carts, I guess, to your waist so that you can pull them behind you. How did that whole cart thing happen?
We ended up in this town. I forget the name of it. When you're walking on the roads in the way that we were, there's people who are just passing you all the time. And because we would spend, we were on the road for days, there was people who were commuting to work or doing their daily drives wherever they were, who were just constantly passing us. So slowly people would start to get interested in what we were doing. And there was this gentleman who he stopped a couple of times and spoke to us, and he ended up seeing us in the town. And he asked us if what our plans were on staying somewhere. And we explained we were going to sort of go further on, find somewhere to camp. He said, well, actually, I have an empty house in the town, which you guys are welcome to use. So we stayed at this empty house, and I mean, there was nothing in it. So we just had our air mattresses and sleeping bags out on the floor. And it was just us and in just this empty bare house, which was filled with spiders and all kinds of other great creepy crawlies. And the following morning, his brother-in-law was outside, and he had brought us this cart and said that, you know, they saw us carrying these heavy packs and saw what it was doing to our feet. So they gave us this pack to, you know, take some of the weight off. And at this point, my feet were, I think, worse than Ian's, because Ian had these new shoes. I'd had new inner soles, but my feet were just torn to pieces. So I opted first of putting my pack in this cart and then just use a belt to basically tow the weight behind me. And the cart was actually really handy because it allowed us to carry so much more water because it was so hot. It was, I don't know what it is in Fahrenheit, but it was about 32, 33 degrees Celsius every day. So I think it's in like the high 80s in Fahrenheit. We were just getting through so much water, and it was great that we could now carry, you know, we could carry gallons of water rather than constantly having 2 litres on us that we were constantly having to refill at every opportunity, asking people to fill them up for us. We could take a little bit of that worry off of our minds. I mean, we smashed out some miles quick.
It was a game changer.
Yeah, it was a huge game changer. So we then were able to put both of our packs in this single cart, and then we just took turns pulling it. We'd do like 2 miles on, 2 miles off, just all day. It was nice then to be able to walk without a pack on and just give our feet like a little bit of a chance to try and recover from constantly just pounding on the hard tarmac. And then I think it was later that day that the family that had given us the cart, they then actually caught up with us again and had a second one for us. After we spoke to them on a mobile phone, they asked us how we were getting on. We told them that it was a huge game changer for us, really helpful. So they supplied us with a second one. I'd hate to think what it would have been like finishing that trip without them, because I honestly don't think we would have been able to do it because our feet were in such a bad way.
Yeah, and bearing in mind, these carts were meant for probably pulling beach stuff and beer down to a creek or down to a river. They weren't meant to be pulled 300 miles, but they lasted when we got them to our final destination in terms of where we were pulling the carts, which was 300 miles. The rubber on the wheels had been completely stripped off, and they were literally on their last legs. They wouldn't really have lasted a hell of a lot longer. So it was quite a sentimental parting when we said goodbye to them, because it changed everything. Absolutely changed everything.
Near the end of your walk, you connect with some Cherokee people. You mentioned a little bit at the beginning, a couple of younger guys, and I think an older guy. What was that experience like walking with those guys?
The reason why we finished it with the 2 Cherokee lads and someone and one of the older members of the Cherokee Nation is we wanted to almost finish the walk together. That was a huge pivotal moment for the journey itself. It was so important for us to do that. And we actually met them on the side of the road. It had been prearranged, and we had previously walked across the Ozark Mountains, so not physically walked across the mountains, but we had crossed through the Ozark Mountains on these back roads and trails and stuff like that, pulling the carts. And then arriving into Tahlequah, they met us at the side of a road, and we kind of introduced ourselves, and there was a lot of questions of why would you like to do this? Why would you be doing a sacred Cherokee trail, which was something that we really, really wanted to speak to them about, to give our perception of why we wanted to do it and show them we were passionate about sharing the Cherokee story. And we did it. We met them with 6 miles left to go. So we parted with the carts, and we had a small support vehicle. So the 5 of us walked 4 of us walked the full 6 miles. And then the older gentleman, who was the guy who was in sort of very knowledgeable about Cherokee sort of traditions and heritage and language, he walked a mile with us. And what we did was we just spoke about life for Cherokee people today, especially for the writer and Parker, who are the two younger guys who walked with us. We really wanted to understand about what it's like, firstly, growing up native in the United States today, and also what it's like for Cherokee, a young Cherokee man growing up in the United States today. But as we went through that last 6 miles, it was actually a real bonding experience, because not only were we really being open and asking questions, me and Jamie, it was our real goal was to just listen, to ask questions and listen. Especially for the latter part of the trip, we were spending time with Cherokee people. Listening and asking questions was our main goal. Rather than telling people about the trip and going too deep about why we were doing it, we were there to learn about the Cherokee. So we ended up becoming actually really good friends with the two younger Cherokee guys, and then spending the last week that we had pretty much every day with them.
So my understanding is that you guys were going to be going on foot over the Ozark Mountains, but because it was so overgrown, you had to change your plans. What happened there?
Basically, it was after we picked up the carts and we've been using them, we must have done about 150 miles or so at this point with the carts. The landscape that we were on when we got the carts in like the east of Arkansas was very flat, but then slowly the hills started to build up to the Ozark Mountains. And our plan was originally to cross straight through the Ozark Mountains on what's called the Ozark Highland Trail. We got to this town, basically, we were able to give them the carts and they were going to send them over to the other side. But the issue we had is when we then got onto the Ozark Highland Trail with our backpacks, which were nowhere near as heavy as they were at the start of the trip, it was so overgrown because it's not a well-trodden trail like the Appalachian Trail is. And I have never seen so many ticks in my life. So I'd never, ever been bitten by a tick before this trip. And day one of camping out on the Ozark Highland Trail, I had 6 ticks that were on me. They were everywhere. So we had to pull like our socks up over our trousers or pants, over the bottoms of them. We had like duct tape taped around to make sure they couldn't get in. They were just crawling all over us. Lyme disease and Rocky Mountain fever were very big issues. So at this point we were like, oh no, with all these ticks, we're probably going to catch one of these diseases. And we had about 10 days ahead of us of walking through the Ozark Mountains in these environments. And where we were going, it was just getting more and more barren. The trails were walked less and less. We made a decision to not do it because it would have slowed us down too much, and it would have been so dangerous if we had got out there and came down with any of those symptoms of the diseases. It was just such a huge problem to have gone through there. It was so hot as well, and water was going to be an issue. So we got in contact with the people that were going to send our carts over to us, and we were able to pick them up when we then got to another town. And we then took the road rather than walking straight through the Ozark Mountains. And we actually added on, it must have been at least 50, 60 miles, because we had to then take the roads all the way around the central part of the mountains. Even on the road, there were so many ticks, wasn't there? We were constantly picking them up because wherever we camped, they were just everywhere, just on all of the blades of grass, just climbing on everything. Talking to the people who lived local to that area, we learned that people weren't walking the Ozark Highlands Trail at that time of year because of the ticks.
Guys, looking back on the adventure, what would you say is the most memorable part of it for you? Or maybe most favorite part?
I loved every aspect of the expedition. I don't think any one bit stands out one more than the other. I have a thing for rivers. I think there's life on a river is a beautiful existence. The waking up every day, the paddling, the wildlife, the lessons that the river teaches you. I'm drawn to those moments on the river. But we were there for a reason. We were there to follow the trail that the Cherokee had walked and travelled. I think the most powerful moment for me of the trip was how the trip finished, and then the following week. So we had finished walking with the two young Cherokee brothers, and we finished at the Cherokee Heritage Center, which is where the Cherokee artifacts are there, and the story of the Trail of Tears is there, and members of the public can come and witness life as it was for Cherokee. And we were met by the mother of the two Cherokee brothers. We were met by members of the people who work at the Cherokee Heritage Center, and we simply walked into the lobby, or the back door lobby of the Cherokee Heritage Center, and we had a hug between a few of us. Me and Jamie had a hug, and we finished there with no sort of celebration really, or no fanfare as such, just happiness that we had finished this sort of sacred trail, which was, we were very privileged to be able to walk. But what really did it for us was that week that we spent with the Cherokee. We spent with learning from Ryder and Parker about what it's like to be growing up as a young native man in the US. But also we spent with native drummers, native dancers. We spoke with people not in charge, but people who care very deeply about the preservation of Cherokee language, Cherokee clothing. We spent a lot of time with someone who recreates Cherokee dresses. And she was an incredibly inspiring lady called Tonya Weevil, who was part of the Cherokee Treasures. They call them national treasures. And these are the people that are in prominent positions of preserving Cherokee culture, certain elements of Cherokee culture. And she was recreating dresses for everybody who would like to have one. We also met Chief John Baker, who is the chief of the Cherokee Nation today. And he welcomed us into his office at the head of the Cherokee Nation. And that was a really, really, really inspiring talk. And what we learned overall was the fact that the Cherokee are a great nation. We're full of great people. And the Trail of Tears is a story of injustice, survival and resistance, and a people who were made to walk from their ancestral homelands, or made to travel away from their ancestral homelands and settle somewhere different. And a fact that they're still thriving as a culture today is a testament to the strength of the Cherokee people.
Just carrying on from what Ian just said there, we saw some fantastic places in the country, you know, places that were similar to the UK. You know, there were parts that we were paddling on the river and we were like, oh, this isn't too similar to paddling on the River Thames. But then, you know, we'd be in these places which are just so vastly different to anything we had. That was all fantastic. But when I now look back at the journey and all of the things we did, the biggest takeaway is the people. They were the reason we were doing it in the first place, as Ian said, the Cherokee, but just the people from start to finish who we met all along. So right back at the start of the trip, on our very first night we spent in the country, we met 3 guys who were camping, Justin, Doug and Rob. And then later on in the trip, you know, they then came to help us out. They drove 3 hours about a month and a half later to bring us some supplies. And then once we got to Memphis and finished the canoe, they drove over like another 4 hours to take the canoe off of our hands, you know, take it on even more adventures. Just the whole way, people just were so curious about what we were doing. And everybody wanted to help. They were offering us places to stay. They'd pull over and they'd picked up food from a supermarket or grocery store. And it's all of these tiny little details that just made the trip so much more special for us. And for me, that's what the bulk of the memories are. People kind of took us into their lives. We'd stay with people. We stayed at this boat dock for a couple of nights where we met these people, Billy and Gina, who were there. And everything they shared with us and the stories we'd share with them, you know, we were just 2 strangers passing through, and everyone was just so humble and welcoming from start to finish.
Yeah, and I'd like to add to that. I think the generosity of the people that we met in Tennessee, in Arkansas, in Oklahoma is just unbelievable. It completely blew us away. People welcoming us into their homes, offering us food, offering us shelter, resupply food, resupply water. People daily were stopping on the side of the road to ask if we needed anything. And I think in today's world, it gives you that faith in humanity that there are people out there that care, there are people out there that want to help, there are people out there that want to make a difference. And I probably imagine there's none of them listening to this podcast at this moment in time. But what I would like to say to them is that act of generosity, that momentary act of generosity changed our expedition. It changed the course of our expedition because it helped us refill a water bottle. It helped nourish our bodies with food. So it was that act of simple generosity alone made such a difference to us. So to the people of Tennessee, Arkansas and Oklahoma, thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, everybody.
Okay, I think that's a good segue to wrap this up. Guys, do you have any, what's going to be next for you? Are there any like media projects spinning out of this adventure, or do you have any other adventures on the horizon?
The story is going to be in Sidetracked magazine. So it's going to be an 18-page article where I've written about certain sections of the trip and a little bit about the Cherokee history in relation to those sections. And Jamie's photos and my photos and Will Saunders' photos are going to appear in that article. That article's coming out in October. Sorry, the magazine's coming out in October. There's stuff on my website, which is www.ianefinch.com. There's 3 smaller articles about incidents or moments of the trip that were really memorable. that people can read. And that's also taken from Sidetracked's website, which is sidetracked.com. And they were one of our main partners for the journey, and alongside Low Alpine, which is the rucksacks that we wore for the journey. And that's the only media that we have planned for this. We're putting it into one place, and we have a great relationship with Sidetracked magazine, and we believe that is the best place to show the images and tell the story. And that's, I think, the only place we would love to have the story shown. If they want to see more pictures, they can find a lot more on Instagram, which is at Jamie Barnes UK or at Ian E. Finch. And there's tons and tons and tons of expedition images. And on the Instagram stories as well, there's lots of videos and stuff like that on there. So if people want to get a really in-depth insight into what happened on the journey, they can find out there.
All right, Ian Finch, Jamie Barnes, thank you so much for coming on the show and sharing your story of traveling the Trail of Tears, and appreciate it. And best of luck to you on your whatever next adventures you have along the way.
Thanks very much. Thanks for your time.
All the best.
Thank you for listening. You can find this episode online at thepursuitzone.com/TPZ179. That's TPZ179. The best way to support this podcast is to subscribe and share this episode with your friends. You can find subscription links at thepursuitzone.com. If you're listening on YouTube, be sure to give this a thumbs up. Like and follow on Facebook or Twitter. The tag is at The Pursuit Zone. To send me feedback, you can write me at paul@thepursuitzone.com, or you can leave a voice message at speakpipe.com/thepursuitzone. This episode was recorded on August 9th, 2019. For the show notes and more great adventure travel podcasts, visit thepursuitzone.com.